All right, so it is 7 o'clock, so we are going to get started. So welcome everyone. It's nice to see you guys for our virtual talk in honor of Women's History Month. Can everyone hear me? We're good? All right, excellent. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Becca Tennell, and I am the Education and Outreach Coordinator at the Chapman Museum. And before we get started, if you haven't already, if you could just mute your microphones, our speaker and myself would really appreciate it. That way we're not interrupted in the middle. So this month, the month of March, is Women's History Month. And it's during this time that we usually like to celebrate women's contributions to history, culture, and society. And tonight we are really fortunate to have Dr. Jill Kracov Zinckgraf of the National Women's History Alliance join us and give a presentation on women's history in New York State. So it's very exciting. We're very excited that we can get her virtually tonight. So just some background that the National Women's History Alliance was founded in 1980. It's a nonprofit educational organization that promotes the study of women's history in grades K through 12, as well as promoting women as leaders and influencers. And they also successfully lobbied Congress to designate March as Women's History Month. So a little fun back there. And Dr. Zinckgraf is the current interim executive director at the National Women's History Alliance. She's been there since January. And she has long been an advocate for women serving in numerous roles that empower and uplift them. And so now I'm going to turn things over to you, Jill, for your talk. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you. I'm so happy to see all women on this call. It always makes the conversation so much richer and deeper, and so grateful. So I'm going to share my screen, everyone. Just going to take me a second to set up my presentation. Okay, and I want to see all of you, which I have lost. Hold on. Oh, did everybody turn off their cameras? Okay, that's fine.
Sorry,
Okay.
I was muted. Yes.
Okay. All right. So when you turn off your cameras, I don't get to see. So just a couple of ground rules, which I think are housekeeping items. Stop me at any time. This presentation really is didactic. It makes for a richer conversation. And so you can stop me at any time. I did build in a few minutes at the end. So if you want, you can hold the questions till the end. So whatever all of you want. So yes, thank you. And I'm so honored to be here. My name is Dr. Jill Kracov Zinckgraf, and I've been working in the field of women's studies and interpersonal violence, domestic violence, and sex assault for a little over 40 years now. I recently left my last position as CEO of a domestic abuse and sexual assault crisis center, and I took on the interim role. I've been serving on the board of the National Women's History Alliance for the last 5 years. And so today, my hope is by the end of this presentation, I will have shared something that you may not have known before and give you the pride in being a woman. And so every year, the National Women's History Alliance picks a theme. And this theme is what's spread throughout the United States in the schools and community groups to celebrate Women's History Month. And this year, it's women who advocate for equity, diversity, and inclusion. And this image here is the cover of our magazine, which gets put out every year. What I thought I would start with is a little bit about how women's history came to be and the women who started it. And what I can share with you is there has been no greater pride than serving on the board with women who have been the trailblazers who set all of this in motion. And I'll share some of them with you tonight. Okay, so part of the Sonoma County Commission on the Status of Women was led by a woman by the name of Molly Murphy McGregor. And she and 4 of her colleagues led the efforts to the first Women's History Week, as you heard, in Sonoma County. I circled Molly Murphy McGregor because after 44 years, she just recently retired as the executive director of the National Women's History Alliance, which started as the National Women's History Project. And so one woman in one singular moment uh, led an entire movement in a nation. And how it all started was a student had come up to Molly and had asked her a question, which she doesn't remember what the question was, but it was about a woman in history. And Molly couldn't find the answer in any of the textbooks. She was teaching social studies at the time. And she thought that that was wrong. And so she wanted to change that. And so, as you heard, this movement went national. And the first presidential proclamation declaring the week of March 8th as National Women's History Week was issued by President Carter in 1980. And then Public Law 100-9, which designates March as Women's History Month. And so Molly's still around. I work very closely with Molly. She is still incredibly active in the movement and has done, and probably will never know how many lives she has impacted. For someone like me who grew up, I was never taught about women in history. All my role models growing up were men until my first Women's History Week happened. And I remember my life changed. The trajectory of my career and what I was going to do the rest of my life was never the same. And so I want to look at why. Because for me, I'm always asking the question of the why. So if you could pull up your chats, I want to know approximately how many women are believed to have perished during the witch trials throughout Europe, not the United States, the Europe witch trials. And the years were approximately 1400 to 1775. Here I have my chat. Oh, 5,000, 5,000. Anyone else want to take kind of a guess? 500. Anyone else? This is throughout medieval Europe, just under 400 years. 10,000. Yeah, those are all really high numbers, everyone. 10,000. So back in the early 1400s, a German priest wrote a book called the Malleus Maleficarum, and it was really how to catch a witch. And this was done in part with the Christian Crusades and Christianity and the doctrine that was being taught at the time. Historians today and over the past 40 years have called the medieval witch trials a Holocaustal event. And it is believed that between 5 million and 6 million women perished, either by their own hands, because once they were accused of being a witch, they knew the torture and the trial and what was going to happen next, or they were found guilty of being a witch and perished. And so again, in the chat, does that surprise any of you? That between 5 and 6 million of our sisters have been perished. I'm just watching the chat just in case. Okay. What I can share with you, when I found out, I was very surprised and sad that I didn't know that. And so why is women's history important? And I'll go a little deeper then, because we need to understand what happened to women throughout medieval Europe. But I think it's also important that women need representation and visibility, because women historically have been marginalized and excluded from historical narratives. And this really does lead to a lack of representation in textbooks, media, and public discourse. I had two choices when I was told I was going to school. It was a secretary or a nurse, and I'm not even that old. And so we keep saying that the next generation, it'll be different. And the next generation, it's not that different, because we know that the wheels of progress are slow. And so women's history was really big in the 80s, 90s, maybe even the early 2000s, but we see it dip off. I think it's important to recognize and celebrate women's achievements, because it really does help correct the imbalance and ensures that these contributions are acknowledged and we value them. I think it's important to inspire and empower the struggles of women and throughout history, because what we know to be true is that we can do it. But if we don't know about it, how can we possibly think about it? I have another really good example of this. If you haven't seen the movie Naiad with Diana Naiad, I so recommend it. And how it didn't get more publicity, there's also a documentary about Diana Naiad on Netflix. I think it's called The Other Shore, where it has the live footage of her and what she was able to accomplish uh, against what everybody told her what was to be true. And so I strongly recommend that. And those are the narratives we need to hear more of. I think it's important to understand the intersectionality of women's history, because those diverse experiences and how that works together gives us the opportunity to understand that we need everybody at the table, not just certain voices, but all voices. Because my experience is going to be very different than all of you, which is going to be different than the rest of the people. And so it's so important that we include race, class, sexual orientation, all of that, religion, socioeconomic status, work, education, all of that builds a richer tapestry for social progress to go forward. And I think that when we learn about women's history and we learn about what women have done and are able to do, it challenges those stereotypes. If we think about stereotypes and how harmful they are to women, I have a whole program that I do around this. The problem with stereotypes is it puts people in boxes that aren't necessarily true. And so it sets up a certain set of expectations and beliefs based solely on your gender or the way you look. And that's really damaging. And so women's history challenges all of that. It also gives us the opportunity to look at social progress and activism. Because what I promise you, and because I'm old enough to say this, is that the things we were fighting for in the 70s and 80s, we're fighting for today. And I think that's really important to know. Because when people say to me, I can't believe we're here, I think about all the things that laid before us and why are we still here? Why are we still fighting for the same rights? And then the last, I think it's really important to promote inclusivity and diversity, which is what I talked about a little bit before. But those historical narratives really deepen the breadth and understanding of what women's experiences were. So let me stop there. And does anyone have any questions? You can unmute or throw in your chat. Okay. Okay. Another thing for you to put in the chat. A historical perspective. In what year did women earn the right to vote? What year was that? 1920? Anyone else? Okay. Well, you would be right. It was, it was August 26, 1920. And in fact, it's one of my favorite days of the year because it's Women's Equality Day. And we're gonna go a little deeper into that. How many years did it take for women to earn the right to vote? If you had to guess, 100 plus? You are very, very close, 200, a little further. Started 1848. Yeah. Interestingly, everyone, I found out that in New Jersey in 1820, I take that back. In New Jersey in 1840, when it became an established state, if you were widowed, you could vote. They repealed that 2 years later. But the fact is, and I live in New Jersey, so it's such an interesting fact. but you could vote before women won the right to vote. So it was 72 years, everyone. It was 72 years. It was a long time to earn that right to vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton said the best protection a woman can have is courage. And, her and Susan B. Anthony had a tremendous amount of courage. Local elections only, correct. And so at the Seneca Falls Convention, the first women's rights convention that was held in the United States was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. And that's where they produced what was called the Declaration of Sentiments, which called for women's suffrage, among other things. Now, the rest of the timeline is very long, so I shortened it a little bit, just so you could get kind of a snapshot of what was happening at the time. In 1869, Wyoming Territory grants women the right to vote in state and local elections only. In 1872, Susan B. Anthony was arrested and charged with illegally voting in a presidential election. And that arrest brought national attention to the suffrage movement. In 1890, the National American Women's Suffrage Association was formed. This was the largest and most influential suffrage organization in the United States. In 1913 was a big women's suffrage parade. It was the first large-scale suffrage parade, and it was held in DC, organized by a woman named Alice Paul, who I'm going to talk a little bit about in a minute, and the National Women's Party, which was the party she started. And it coincided with President Wilson's inauguration, which attracted thousands of people from all over the states. In 1916, Jeannette Rankin was elected to Congress, although very short-lived. She voted against World War I and was outed from the House of Representatives. In 1917, the Silent Sentinels started to picket the White House. These were members of the National Women's Party, and they began picketing outside the White House to demand suffrage. And they were arrested and subjected, as you may or may not know, to harsh treatment. And this really, again, drew national attention to the suffrage cause. 1918, President Wilson, for the first time, endorses suffrage. And in 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified. And so that took more than 7 decades. And if you had to guess how many women today who are eligible to vote, what percentage do you think that is in the United States? 35. Very, very close. It's 40%. Yeah, 30%. It's 40%, approximately 40%. And I believe state and local is probably even a little lower. So in 1913, I wanted to talk a little bit about Inez Milholland. In 1913, she said, "I'm prepared to sacrifice every so-called privilege in order to have a few rights." And she sacrificed what has been argued the most, and that was with her life. And so a little bit about Inez. Her causes were really far-reaching. She was not only interested in prison reform, but she also sought world peace and worked for equality among Black Americans. She was a member of the NAACP and the Women's Trade Union League and the Equality League of Self-Supporting Women in New York, which was women's political union, the National Child Labor Committee, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She was part of the National Women's Party, and she worked really closely with Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, who were really the leaders in getting women the right to vote. And so when she stepped onto her first suffrage parade on May 7th, 1911, she held a sign that read, "Forward, out of error, leave behind the night, forward through the darkness, forward into the light." And she really very quickly became the face of the suffrage movement. And one of the things she really believed is that she believed that women were what she called the house cleaners of the nation. She believed that women votes could remove social ills like sweatshop, tenements, prostitution, hunger, poverty, and child mortality. And I don't know that she was wrong. And so the concluding words of her last suffrage speech before she passed away of she had a form of anemia, but she wanted to go on this parade because it was so important to her, was, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Also during this time, Ida B. Wells stated that the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. And during this time, she worked very hard on the anti-lynching crusade. She was a journalist, also a women's rights activist who fought for the inclusion of African-American women in the suffrage movement. And she really was one of the first people to highlight the intersectionality of race and gender in her activism. It's the first time we started to really understand what intersectionality meant. She was a founding member of the NAACP and played a big role in earning women the right to vote. And she was an educator and reformer. And so through her activism, in part with Alice Paul and Lucy Burns and Inez, they were really the crux of the women's suffrage movement. So Alice Paul, and I loved her to the end because she continued her work after the suffrage movement, but she was arrested and jailed 7 times for obstructing sidewalk traffic during her protests. And she made the decision to go on a hunger strike. And in that hunger strike, they started to force feed her with tubes down her throat and raw eggs. And she was able to sneak a note out to let the public know how she was being treated. At the time, you just needed 2 doctors to say that you were insane and you could be hospitalized or institutionalized against your will. And when the doctor, the psychiatrist met with her, what Alice Paul said was that courage in women is often mistaken for insanity. And this struck that doctor so much that he then fought to get her out of jail. She later went on and fought for the amendment to the ERA. And so I have a question. So get out your chats again. And what year was the ERA officially incorporated into the United States Constitution? And what year did the Constitution amend itself to say that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any other state on account of sex? Andrea says it hasn't been done. Anyone else? I don't think it was ever ratified. Anyone else? I don't think it has happened yet. Oh, can I just tell you, I think you're going to be my favorite group of people. People always have a year in mind. It was never ratified, everyone. And so when people say to me, yeah, but we're equal, and put it in the Constitution, I cannot believe it is the year 2024. And that ratification has not happened. And so in 1923, that was introduced by Alice Paul. But what you should know, it made very little progress until the 70s, because for most of the 20th century, Congress was comprised mostly of men. And nearly 5 decades between 1923 and 1970, only 10 women served in the Senate, with no more than 2 serving at the same time. And the picture was only slightly better in the House of Representatives. In 1970, we really got a new class of lawmakers. We got Representatives Martha Griffiths and Shirley Chisholm. And so they pressed to make the ERA a top legislative priority. So in March of 1972, the amendment passed both chambers of Congress with bipartisan support, far exceeding the 2/3 majority required. and Congress promptly sent the proposal amendment to the states for ratification. Here's the caveat: they put a 7-year deadline, which they have never done to any of the other amendments. That's the problem. At the same time, there was a movement to stop the ERA because they really believed that the ERA measure would lead to gender neutral bathrooms, same-sex marriages, and women in the military combat, among other things. And this opposition was incredibly successful. It really was. So support for the ERA eroded, particularly amongst Republicans. So when it went back out to the states, they extended the timeline, but some of those states who voted yes rescinded that because this campaign was so wildly successful, which I still don't understand. But by 1977, only 35 states had ratified. And then 5 states pulled back. In 1982, that was the extension of the deadline. And now they've accepted the defeat. It's making a little bit of a comeback. I always wonder, because people will say to me one of two things: we don't need the ERA. And I think I don't even understand that. And the other thing people will say, what's the big deal? And to both my responses are, then just put it in. If it's no big deal and we don't need it, put it in. What's stopping you? And so here's the thing, and I love what Ruth Bader Ginsburg said. She said, if I could choose an amendment to add to the Constitution, it would be the Equal Rights Amendment. I think we've achieved that through legislation, but legislation, as you've seen, can be repealed. It can be altered. So I would like my granddaughters, when they pick up the Constitution, to see the notion that women and men are persons of equal stature. I'd like them to see that as a basic principle of our society. And so as all of this was going on, the United States was in the midst of many cultural revolutions. You had the overturning of the Comstock Act, the Vietnam War, the LGBT or Stonewall, the LGBTQIA plus community rights, or what we call gay and lesbian rights at the time. You had Roe v. Wade. You had the civil rights movement, anti-war movement. The whole nation was exploding. And so during this time, a lot of people started coming out. Now I include this picture that showed up in Time magazine of 1972, because I want to take a moment and, understanding women's history is really paying homage to people who risked it all. So this picture, Mother Nature is a Lesbian, that showed up in Time magazine 1972, was taken during a time where people in the military, men, were forced out of the military if they shared that they were gay. The person in this photo who wrote Mother Nature is a Lesbian had just seen a documentary on seagulls. And there's a type of seagull that is a lesbian, that they raise these kids together, these little small seagulls together. And so she got this idea and she wrote this with lipstick. This is the president of the board of the National Women's History Alliance. At the time, she was a social studies teacher teaching in upstate New York. She drove all the way down to Midtown, and she wrote this with lipstick. And what she is most proud about, which I think is so fascinating, because I didn't even know this. I remember this picture, but I didn't know this, is that the lettering here has been turned into a font called Protest Font that you can download. She's very proud of that. And so at the time for her, she had not come out of the closet. She was teaching, and her parents didn't know yet. And so it forced her into a place where she might not have otherwise gone, but she risked it all to protect that man who was being thrown out of the military, and for her sisters. And so really amazing. And so why women's study or women's history? Because today we still have a gender pay gap. And, conversations about pay gap started in 1965, and we're still at 83.7 cents. The Fair Pay Act, while enacted, I don't know how much weight it holds. And part of this is women's labor still today is very undervalued. Most of the disparity in women and men's pay cannot be explained by measurable differences between them. Out of the causes of the wage gap that we can measure, the main contributor is that women are more likely than men to work in lower paying jobs that offer fewer benefits. And what we know is that this leads to poverty because minimum wage is not a living wage. You just can't. We also know that since the 70s, gender-based violence is the same. It hasn't changed. Now, do I think adding women to the Constitution will change it? I think that's too simple, but I do think it's a start. I think that if women knew and men knew and that the laws protected the same, something would change or something would hold some weight or value. But in gender-based violence, 1 in 4 women at any point are survivors of domestic violence. It means, and estimates are as low as 25% of the American population is walking around as a victim of domestic violence, and 1 in 5 women will experience sexual assault. That doesn't even include sexual harassment, which is another whole can of worms. And so these numbers haven't changed. Every 4 hours, we are burying a sister to violence, every 4 hours. And so what I would say is something has to change. And so if nothing has changed since the 70s, then we have to do this differently. One of the things that people often will say is that in leadership roles, women still only make up 27% of the Senate and 27.6% of the House. And so also in a study done by Catalyst, women only held 7.4% of CEO positions in Fortune 500 companies. And so it's just not enough. A McKinsey report in 2021 found that women accounted for just 26% of executive senior level positions in S&P 500 companies. And so over and over and over, we see that there's kind of a pattern if we collect and connect the dots. And so if we change some of this, maybe those outcomes would change. And there are so many women doing this work, kind of boots on the ground. And so I wanted to take a moment and really honor some of the voices that are coming through and really making significant change. One is Tarana Burke. You can't go far without understanding or hearing the Me Too movement. She really has been a prominent advocate for survivors of sexual harassment and assault, particularly for marginalized communities. And she really continues to work towards creating safer spaces and amplifying voices of those who have historically been marginalized or silenced. Ava DuVernay, she's a filmmaker and advocate for diversity and inclusion in the entertainment industry. She's known for her work in producing and directing films and television shows that center on underrepresented voices. She founded an organization called Array. This is a film distribution and advocacy collective dedicated to promoting those films by women and people of color. And Arlan Hamilton, who's the founder and managing partner of Backstage Capital, which is a venture capital film that invests in underrepresented founders, including women, people of color, the LGBTQI plus community, and other entrepreneurs. And she is a vocal advocate for diversity in the startup ecosystem, and she works to provide opportunities for marginalized individuals. And just a couple other people I wanted to highlight. Patrice Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi. They're the co-founders of Black Lives Matter movement. These 3 women continue to advocate for racial justice and empower Black communities. They have mobilized millions. Think about that, millions of people around the world to protest against police brutality and systematic racism. And of course, Stacey Abrams, who's a politician and lawyer and voting rights advocate. Abrams really has been instrumental in advocating for fair elections, voter registration, and voter suppression efforts, which still happen today. I mean, it's amazing to me that if you are eligible to vote, you are still being turned away from the polls. And so not all voices are being heard. Now, I told you I serve on a board with some amazing people. And one of the people I serve with, her aunt, Reverend Dr. Polly Murray, was just put on the US quarter this year. And so Reverend Dr. Polly Murray was a civil rights activist. Now, here's the thing. Until I met Rosita, who's on our board, I didn't even know about Polly Murray. But if I were to tell you that Polly Murray was the first Black woman at the age of 16 to be arrested for sitting on the wrong side of a bus because it was for whites only, would that surprise you? It surprised me. She was the first Black woman to go to Howard Law. She was the first Black Episcopal priest, female Episcopal priest, and did so much. She did so much in this movement. And so she was also a legal scholar, an author, a poet, a theorist, and a women's rights advocate. She was the co-founder of the National Organization for Women, what we know as NOW. Didn't know that. And so she also was the legal scholar on Brown versus Board of Ed to help dismantle legal segregation and laid the foundation for the civil rights movement with Thurgood Marshall. And so I think it's so important that we honor all those that paved the path that allow us to kind of move that part of it forward. And so I believe that together, not separate, we get to move the needle, because I always said, if we just move the earth on its axis by 1 degree, imagine how different it could be. And so I want to wish all of you a very, very happy Women's History Month. I hope you celebrate it and feel good about it. And so that's the presentation. And if it's okay with all of you, I'll stop my share. You can visit us at nationalwomenshistoryalliance.org. We have so much information. We're in the process of redoing the website. There's a lot there. But if you ever needed anything, certainly you could reach out to me or visit us on the website.